In the spring of 2014, a county extension agent named Dale Pruitt stood inside a half-repaired equipment shed in Custer County, Nebraska, and told a woman named Vera Holst that she was running a sentimental project, not a cattle operation. He said it with the measured patience of a man who had delivered the same verdict to a dozen romantics before her, his clipboard angled toward the light, his projection figures already printed and ready to hand over. Vera was 51 years old. She had been working that particular 40 acres since she could walk it, and she listened to Dale without a word. When he finished, she folded the projection sheet once and set it on a fence post and went back to checking water lines. The shed smelled like her father's work coats. Outside, her dogs moved the cattle through the near pasture with the low ease of long practice. 8 years later, in the late August heat of 2022, a livestock buyer named Marcus Teed drove 3 hours from Kansas City to stand in that same barnyard, and when Danny Holst, Vera's granddaughter, read the price sheet aloud, the number that came off the page was $144,000. It was for 48 head of belted Galloway beef, sold in a single transaction at $3.85 a pound hanging weight. The county average that season for commercial Angus cattle after the drought, took what it took and the feed loans did the rest, was $1,340 a head. Vera had cleared over $3,000 per animal off ground that every working rancher in the county had passed on. This is the story of the years between those two moments. It is the story of a breed most Nebraska cattlemen hadn't thought about since their grandfathers. 40 acres of cedar-choked draw and rocky flat that the county assessor had valued at $1,100 total, and a woman who understood something about the land under her boots that, if you have ever watched a system dismiss something it could not count, stay with this one. The number at the end is worth the walk. Let me begin with Harold Holst, because nothing that happened in 2022 started in 2022. Harold came to Custer County from Holt County in 1966, newly married and carrying 30 years of his father's observations about grass and cattle and what the Nebraska sandhills would and would not sustain. He ran commercial Angus for 6 years, the same as everyone else, and he did well enough. Then, in the winter of 1971, a letter arrived from a rancher in Saskatchewan who had 2 belted Galloway breeding pairs he needed to move before spring. Harold had read about Galloways in a cattleman's journal, had written to 3 breeders with questions about cold tolerance and forage conversion, and had saved the replies in a tin box that still sat on the shelf above Vera's desk when the story starts. He drove to the Canadian border and came back with 2 bulls and 4 cows, and the neighbors thought he had taken leave of his senses. The Holst home place was 310 acres in all, but the working heart of it had always been the south pasture, the 270 acres of decent grass Harold kept in rotation. The 40 acres to the east was something else. A rocky draw ran through it, draining poorly, and thick stands of eastern red cedar had been creeping south from a shelter belt for 30 years. The ground was rough and broken. Harold's father had used it for winter windbreak. When Harold died in 1997, the estate attorney noted the 40 acres separately in his inventory and valued it at next to nothing. Vera kept it. She did not have a plan for it. She kept it because her father had kept it, and because she had watched the cedar stands fill with whitetail in November, and she believed in the way that people who work one piece of ground for a lifetime believe things that land does not stay what it appears to be if you are patient enough. She had been running a small Galloway herd since 1989, starting with 2 of Harold's original bloodlines and building carefully, culling hard, keeping records in a ledger that had become 3 ledgers by the time Dale Pruitt arrived in 2014. 50 head, 3 breeding bulls, 47 cows, and heifers. The whole herd the color of a winter field, with their distinctive white belt running clean around their middles. They moved through the south pasture with a deliberateness that struck first-time visitors as sluggish and struck Vera as exactly correct. Vera Holst was known for two things in Custer County: her patience and her cattle, and most people who knew her could not always tell the difference between the two. Let me tell you about belted Galloways, because the mechanism matters, and the mechanism is not what Dale Pruitt's projection sheets were designed to see. The Galloway is a Scottish hill breed with records going back to the 16th century in the uplands of Galloway and Dumfries, southwestern Scotland, country that makes the Nebraska sandhills look forgiving. The breed developed over centuries in a region where feed was scarce, winters were prolonged and wet, and an animal that required supplemental shelter or grain to survive was an animal a small crofter could not afford. What came out of that selection pressure was a double coat, two distinct layers of hair, a dense and oily weather-resistant outer layer, and a fine, crimped, insulating undercoat that the animal grows in fall and sheds in spring. A Galloway cow in December does not look cold because she is not cold. Not in any weather that Nebraska has reliably produced in a century of records. The double coat matters for one reason that the breed books explain, and one reason they tend not to explain as fully. The first is the reason the breed books explain most readily. Animals that are not cold do not burn calories keeping warm. The Galloway cow in a Nebraska February is converting her feed to body condition, not to heat maintenance. This is why Galloway herds historically overwinter on less supplemental feed than equivalent commercial breeds, sometimes 30 to 40% less hay per animal through a comparable winter. Harold Holst had calculated this per head over 10 winters and written the figures in his tin box, and Vera had verified them over 20 more. The second reason is less often explained. An animal bred for hill country with scarce forage has a different relationship to available vegetation than an animal bred for improved pasture. Galloways browse. They will work a cedar thicket for the low branches and the understory growth beneath. They will graze where commercial breeds decline to walk. They will clear terrain that a conventional operation writes off as unworkable, not by appetite alone, but by instinct, by a centuries-old behavioral inheritance that keeps them moving across rough ground, looking for what is there rather than standing at the gate waiting for what is delivered. Harold had watched this in his first Nebraska winters and written about it carefully. Vera had read those notes until the margins were soft. She had not told Dale Pruitt about the margins. Dale came to the Holst place in March of 2014 as part of a county outreach program, visiting operations he considered at risk of underperformance. He was 40 years old, had a master's degree in animal science from the University of Nebraska, and he was not a bad man. He was the kind of extension agent who returned calls, who drove gravel roads in bad weather, who genuinely believed that his job was to help people make a living. He believed in the data, and the data for belted Galloways in a commercial beef market was thin and, where it existed, unpromising. The breed was not recognized by the major commercial grading systems in any way that rewarded its particular genetics. His spreadsheet projected a conventional Angus operation on improved ground at $180 per head net margin. His spreadsheet, applied to Vera's 50 Galloways on rough ground, returned a number he described as not viable as a commercial herd. He set his clipboard on the tailgate of his university green pickup and walked her through the columns. He was kind about it. He had a soft, precise voice and the habit of finishing his sentences with a slight upward inflection, as though offering a gentle second opinion rather than a verdict. The Galloways are a sentimental project, Mez. Holst, he said, I understand the family attachment. But in a commercial market, you're carrying 50 head on rough ground with no infrastructure for grain finishing, no feedlot access, no premium channel. Vera looked at the clipboard. She looked at her cattle. My father ran a different set of numbers, she said. Dale nodded with the patience of a man who had heard this before. He drove back to Broken Bow with his projection sheets and wrote in his case notes that the Holst operation was a legacy situation with limited commercial potential. Boots, Vera's border collie, watched the green pickup until it was gone, then looked back at Vera. She told him to get the cattle moving, and he went. And Ed Kovar ran the operation directly north of the Holst place, and in 2014 he was the most obviously prosperous cattleman on that section of County Road. He ran 280 acres of improved brome grass and fescue, kept commercial Angus, and had just financed a new hydraulic squeeze chute, a mechanical bale feeder, and an upgraded sprayer system at a combined cost of $340,000 on a 10-year equipment note. He was a good neighbor. He brought a chain, saw the winter Vera's cottonwood came down across her lane, and he meant it when he said she should call if she needed anything. His operation was everything Dale Pruitt's projection sheet approved of. It was uniform, measurable, debt financed toward growth. The logic behind Ed's choices was sound, by every metric the county extension office tracked. Improved brome grass on mechanically aerated and fertilized ground returned consistently higher yield per acre than any unmanaged native stand, and the commercial Angus market was deep and reliable. His calves weaned at heavier weights than Vera's. They hit the commodity scale at the right numbers. His operation had a line of credit at the Loop Valley Bank, a relationship he had maintained since his father handed the place over in 2001, and the bank's agricultural lending officer had told him twice in the last 3 years that the fundamentals were strong. The equipment note was real, but the payment fit the projected income, and in a normal year, the margins were acceptable. His sprayer went out in September of 2016 and cost him $11,000 to repair after the hydraulic system failed in the middle of a late-season herbicide pass. He put it on the line of credit and paid it down through the following spring. He told Vera about it over the fence one morning. Not complaining, just accounting. She listened. She did not say anything about the sprayer. She did not own. By 2018, Ed had bought a new self-propelled mower to manage the brome grass and added a third feed bunk to the south lot at a cost of roughly $14,000 more. His operation ran clean and tight and required a considerable amount of machinery to stay that way. At the county coffee meeting in February of 2019, the local Farm Bureau representative used Ed Kovar's operation as a case study in sustainable cattle production for Custer County. Ed thanked him quietly and drove home in his 2017 pickup. His daughter was starting college in Kearney in the fall, and the tuition did not factor into the farm projections. He was managing everything. He was doing what a careful, experienced cattleman was supposed to do. Danny Holst arrived in May of 2016, 2 weeks after finishing her agriculture degree at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. She had taken courses in range management, livestock systems, and agricultural economics, and she had a young person's confidence in what she had been taught. She loved her grandmother without reservation and was quietly embarrassed by the Galloways. She had written a paper her junior year on the commercial viability of heritage breeds in Great Plains beef markets and had concluded, with the honest rigor of a student who had done the reading, that the market infrastructure simply was not there. She told Vera this at the kitchen table, her first week home, the ledger books stacked between them, Boots asleep under Vera's chair. "The premium channel doesn't exist at volume," Danny said. "There's no buyer who's going to pay above commodity for 50 head of heritage beef in Custer County." "Your great-grandfather thought the same thing about winter grass," Vera said. Danny did not know what to do with that. She filed it as sentiment. She stayed on through the summer to help, telling herself she was being useful while she figured out what to do next. By August, she had learned to move cattle with Boots and could read a pasture rotation from the condition of the grass. She was not yet watching the cedars on the East 40. That would come later. What Vera was doing on the East 40 in 2016 was something Dale Pruitt's site visit had not included in its inventory because Vera had not mentioned it and he had not asked. Let me tell you about brush clearing by grazing, because this is where the 40 acres begins to explain itself. Eastern red cedar is not native to the Nebraska sandhills. It arrived with European settlement, spread by birds eating the berries, and in the decades since it has been one of the most persistent land management problems in the Central Plains. A dense cedar stand intercepts rainfall before it reaches the ground, shades out grass and forbs, raises soil temperature at the surface, and drives off the species diversity that healthy prairie requires. Land managers who want to reclaim cedar-invaded ground have three conventional options: prescribed, fire, mechanical removal with equipment, or herbicide. All three cost money. Prescribed fire requires permits, weather, windows, and containment. Mechanical removal on rough ground with poor access can run $300 to $600 an acre. Herbicide is cheaper but kills indiscriminately and requires repeated applications. Galloway cattle present a fourth option that is documented but rarely exploited because it requires an animal with the foraging instinct to use it. Galloways will browse cedar, not the mature trunk, not the dense canopy, but the low branches, the seedlings, and the mid-story growth up to about 6 feet. In a herd of 50, rotated through a rough 40-acre parcel on a disciplined schedule, the animals systematically suppress the cedar understory, trample seedlings, and open the canopy floor to light. The process takes years. It is not a quick fix. What it produces over a decade of managed grazing is a gradual reclamation of the ground below the cedars, the reestablishment of native grass and 4 species that the cedar canopy had suppressed, and an increase in forage density that progressively reduces the amount of supplemental feed the herd requires. Harold had started this on 4 acres in 1988 and written about it in his third ledger. Vera had extended it to the full East 40 beginning in 2009, rotating her herd through on a 60-day cycle, watching the ground recover section by section. By 2016-17, of the 40 acres had measurable grass reestablishment. By 2019-31. The cattle were doing work that the county assessor's office had not revisited and that Dale Pruitt had not included in any column. The East 40, on paper, was still worth $1,100. Under Vera's boots, it was something else entirely. Danny noticed the difference sometime in the spring of 2017, on a cold morning when she pushed the herd through the east gate and watched the Galloways spread out across the recovering ground without prompting, without being driven, working the terrain with a purposefulness that stopped her in the middle of the lane. The cattle she had studied in her coursework stood at hay bales and waited to be fed. These cattle were doing something. She stood there long enough that Boots looked back at her from 20 yards ahead, wondering why she had stopped. She did not say anything to Vera that morning. She went back to the records in the evening and started reading her great-grandfather's third ledger for the first time. Harold's handwriting was small and precise, the writing of a man who had been careful with paper, because paper was not cheap in the years when he had formed his habits. He had recorded forage observations in the cedar ground from 1988 through 1996, noting the cedar suppression, the grass reestablishment in shaded patches, and the per-head hay savings he calculated each winter against the county average for similar-sized commercial herds. He had developed his own rough accounting for the land improvement value, not in dollar terms, but in carry capacity terms. How many animals could the East 40 support in a normal winter, and how had that number changed from year to year under the Galloways' management? The numbers climbed slowly. They climbed in the direction Harold had predicted they would climb, based on observations he had begun making 20 years before the rest of the county had developed a vocabulary for what he was doing. Danny read it twice, over 2 evenings, and then sat with it closed in her hands for a while. She had written in her college paper that the premium beef market lacked the infrastructure to reward heritage genetics at volume. That was still true. But she had not, in writing the paper, considered what happened when a person worked a heritage herd on recovering native ground for 30 years without waiting for the infrastructure to catch up. She had been modeling the market as it existed. Her great-grandfather had been building toward a market he believed would arrive because the conditions that created it were already in motion. He had simply not lived to see them close. She started looking carefully and on her own for where that market might have gotten to. She found Marcus Teed's Co-op through a ranching publication in the fall of 2017 in a 2-paragraph announcement about a regional premium channel expansion into Nebraska. She wrote the initial inquiry letter herself and did not mention it to Vera until she had a response. The response asked the 3 questions Marcus later followed up on in person, and when she read them, she understood that he was asking precisely the things that Harold's third ledger had been tracking for 9 years before he died. By 2018, Ed Kovar's operation had the look of the county's future. He had added a second mechanical feeder and run his equipment note to $375,000 total, refinanced at a lower rate when the Extension Office advertised a rural loan program. He brought in a consultant from Lincoln to analyze his pasture rotation and switch to a fescue blend the consultant recommended for higher yield per acre. His numbers looked good on the reports he shared with the bank. The cattle were uniform, the infrastructure was modern, and the grass stood thick and green in June. At the County Ranching Conference in October of 2018, Dale Pruitt gave a presentation on sustainable operations in Custer County. He included a section on heritage breeds and concluded, with his characteristic measured fairness, that while the genetics had their appeal, the commercial infrastructure for marketing heritage beef at volume in the region. He mentioned the Holst operation by name as an example of a legacy situation that had chosen sentiment over scale. A sentimental project on rough ground, he said, and there were people in that room who nodded. Vera was not at the conference. She was checking water on the east. 40, Danny was in the room. She sat in the 3rd row and felt something she did not yet know how to name. She had read Harold's ledger twice by then. She had been corresponding, on her own initiative, with a premium beef cooperative based in Kansas City whose catalog listed belted Galloway beef at a price point she had not expected to see attached to a breed name. She had not told Vera yet. She was not sure why. She drove home that evening and found Vera at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Harold's tin box open in front of her, reading something by the hanging light. Boots was at her feet. Danny sat down across from her. How long has the East 40 been recovering? She said. Vera set down her cup. Since 2009 in a serious way. Since 1988 in the corners. Donnie looked at the tin box. Did you know it would work? I knew what the grass looked like in 1988 when he started, Vera said. I knew what it looked like in 1997 when he died. That was enough to go on. Marcus Teed reached out to Danny in the winter of 2021 after she had submitted a sample inquiry through the co-op's producer portal with photographs of the herd and a grazing record summary she had compiled from Vera's 3 ledgers. He asked 3 questions by email. How long had the herd been grass-finished without supplemental grain? What percentage of the finishing weight came from forage versus supplemental feed? And had the East 40 acreage been certified for pesticide-free management? The answers were 12 years of documented grain-free finishing, 94% forage, and no formal certification, but 30 years of records showing no herbicide, no pesticide, and no commercial fertilizer applications. Marcus drove out in February of 2021. He was a careful, unhurried man who said almost nothing while he walked the herd, crouching once to examine the ground of the East 40 and pressing his hand flat to the soil the way a person does when they are confirming something they already suspected. He ate lunch at Vera's kitchen table and asked about Harold's tin box and what was in it. Vera let him read 2 pages of the 3rd ledger. He thanked her and said he would be in touch. That same February, Dale Pruitt made a final site visit to the Holst place at Danny's invitation. She had asked him to come look at the East 40 on the pretense of discussing a range management question, but what she wanted was for him to see the ground. He walked the recovered acres with her in the cold afternoon light, stopping at the fence line where the untouched cedar stood, dense and dark, on the neighbor's side, and the Holst ground opened out into recovering native grass, blue stem coming back in patches douse, the soil darker and more textured than anything you'd expect from a rough draw that had been written off for decades. Dale looked at it for a while without speaking. I still think it's a sentimental project, he said finally. But I'll admit the ground is different than I expected. That was February 2021. By June of 2022, the summer raked everything flat. The drought that arrived in Custer County that year was measured and documented and compared by the time it was over to 1988 and to 1956. It came with 6 weeks of above 100-degree heat in July and August, with no meaningful rainfall from the last week of May through the 3rd week of September. Improved brome grass and fescue went dormant in late June and did not recover. County records would later show that the average forage availability on improved commercial pastures dropped to approximately 22% of normal through the critical summer months. Ed Kovar's brome grass went first in the last days of June. He moved cattle off the south pasture and started running hay from a pile he had put up in May. By mid-July, the pile was gone, and he was buying emergency hay at prices that had not been seen in the county in a generation. $145 a round bale delivered, and he needed 40 bales a month. He culled 60 head at distressed late summer prices when it became clear that he could not carry the full herd through to fall. The culled animals went at commodity floor pricing. He spent $28,000 on emergency hay between July and September and restructured $190,000 of his equipment note in October, buying time at a higher rate. He did what any careful cattleman in his position would have done, and it nearly put him under the improved pasture on the county's commercial operations, held at roughly the same figure as Ed's. Dale Pruitt spent that summer driving from operation to operation, trying to help people minimize their losses. And what he saw was what the projections had not modeled. A system built for normal conditions on improved ground had no reserves for a summer that was not normal. Vera Holst's Galloways did not require emergency hay. The East 40's recovering native grass, looseem and switchgrass and buffalo grass, has deeper root systems than improved cool-season species. Native prairie grasses evolved on the Great Plains under conditions that included periodic severe drought, and they respond to heat and dryness by going into a slow dormancy, rather than a collapse, drawing down reserves from root systems that can extend 6, 8, even 12 feet below the surface. They do not recover yield in a drought summer. They do not yield what they yield in a normal year. What they do not do is disappear. There's a difference between dormancy and death that looks identical from a truck window in July but reads differently to a person who walks the ground. Vera walked hers every morning through June and July, boots beside her, checking the root crowns of the bluestem and buffalo grass with the same attention her father had taught her, pulling a handful at the base to see whether the crown was still white and firm or gone dry and hollow. A hollow crown means the root has given up. A firm white crown means the plant is waiting. On the East 40 and the two native corners of the South pasture, the crowns were white through July. The grass looked terrible from the road and was fine at the root. Vera had 53 usable acres of native and recovering grass between the East 40 and those south corners which she had been managing without commercial inputs since 2003. She rotated her herd through on a 45-day cycle and watched the grass carefully and pulled the cattle when the ground told her to pull them. She bought a single delivery of hay in August, 18 bales, a hedge against the September she was not certain about. The Galloways' double coat and their lower metabolic demand in heat meant they were not burning weight at the rate commercial Angus typically burned weight in sustained high temperatures. They came through the summer lean and tight and recovered fast once the October rains arrived. She did not cull a single animal. Danny had been watching all of it. She spent the drought summer logging grass condition by pasture section, pulling crown samples the way Vera had taught her, measuring remaining forage against the cattle's body condition scores in a notebook she had started that spring. She drove past Ed Kovar's place twice a week, watching the hay deliveries come in. She kept her own parallel ledger, the way Harold had kept his, comparing Vera's per-head input costs against the county emergency figures. Dale Pruitt was compiling in his distress visits to neighboring operations. By September, she had a clear number. Vera had spent roughly $412 per head on total inputs for the year. The county average for commercial operations after the emergency hay and the distressed culling was running above $950 per head, and still climbing. 48 head went to market that November. 2 were held back as foundation breeding stock, 1 young bull and 1 heifer Danny had selected. Let me tell you about the fat, because this is what Marcus Teed's price sheet was measuring, and it is the third mechanism that Dale Pruitt's projection did not model. Beef fat is not a single substance. The color, texture, flavor, and nutritional profile of fat deposited in a carcass vary by genetics, by feed, and by time on feed. Commercial, grain-finished beef produces fat that sets white and firm, marbled in a pattern that the USDA grading system rewards with its choice and prime designations. The system was designed around grain-finished Angus genetics, and it does what it was designed to do, which is reward a particular fat profile produced in a particular way. Belted Galloway genetics produce a different fat profile under grass finishing, and it is not a worse profile by any standard except the conventional grading scale. The fat runs a warmer yellow gold from the beta-carotene in the grass diet. It is softer at room temperature. It has a higher ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids than grain-finished commercial beef, and it carries flavor compounds from the forage diversity of the pasture that a uniform grain diet does not produce. A chef who works with grass-finished heritage beef and a chef who works with commodity choice beef are working with different ingredients. Most chefs who have worked with both have a preference. Marcus Teed's co-op had spent 8 years building a distribution channel to restaurants and specialty markets willing to pay for that difference. His buyers were specific and patient, and they paid on hanging weight after carcass grading against a premium scale his co-op had developed. On that scale, documented grain-free Galloway genetics from a grass-finished herd with clean land management records graded at the top tier, $3.85 a pound hanging weight. The average hanging weight of Vera's animals that November was 780 pounds per head. Marcus drove out on a Tuesday morning in late November, Danny at the kitchen table with a laptop, Vera standing by the back door with her coffee. Boots was at her feet. Marcus had a printed summary of the carcass results in a manila envelope, and he slid it across the table to Danny, without saying anything first, the way a man who has delivered numbers for a living learns to let the numbers speak before he does. Danny opened it. She read the per-head figure. She looked at Marcus. She looked at her grandmother. She did the math aloud slowly. 48 head, 780 pounds average, $3, $144,144. Nobody spoke for a moment. Vera looked at the table. Outside, the November light lay flat and gray across the barnyard, and the East 40 was a band of brown and bronze beyond the fence line. The number landed the way numbers land when they confirm something a person has been carrying for a very long time without being able to show it to anyone. It was not a shocking number, the way a lottery ticket is a shocking number. It was a conclusion. The mechanism had worked exactly as Harold's third ledger said it would work. Adjusted for the 30 additional years of patience Vera had added to the calculation, and the number on the page was simply the arithmetic made visible. Vera did not sit down. She stood by the back door with her coffee and looked at the envelope on the table for a while, and Boots watched her face the way a dog watches when it cannot read the situation and is waiting to be told. Then she set her cup down and came to the table and picked up the summary herself and read through it, the way she read anything, carefully and without rushing. When she set it down, she looked out the window toward the east. 40. The blue stem was brown and matted with November frost. The Galloways were in the south pasture, moving in their slow, deliberate way along the fence line, the white belts catching the gray morning light like chalk lines. She had been waiting for this number since 1997. Danny set the paper down. Vera looked at Marcus. "My father would have done the math differently," she said. "I'd like to read that ledger sometime," Marcus said. Dale Pruitt came out the following week at Danny's call. Vera let Danny handle it. Dale sat at the kitchen table with the co-op summary in front of him and read it through twice, the same careful attention he gave to every document, the clipboard set to one side this time. When he looked up, his expression was the expression of a man who has been honest with himself for long enough that being wrong does not destroy him, only redirects him. "I was modeling the wrong market," he said. He turned the paper over. "I was modeling commodity beef on improved ground. I never modeled this. He asked Donnie to explain the East 40 reclamation from the beginning, and she did. He asked about the hay figures for the 2022 season and compared them against Ed Kovar's numbers in his notebook. He did not flinch at the comparison. He wrote for a long time. "Would your grandmother be willing to present at the spring extension meeting?" said. Vera said it from the kitchen doorway. "She'd rather have the ranchers come see the ground." Dale said that was probably better anyway. He was right. In the spring of 2023, 11 Custer County ranchers walked the East 40 with Vera and Donnie in groups of 3 and 4 over the course of 2 weeks. Ed Kovar was among the first. He came on a Thursday morning with a notebook and walked the fence line between his brome grass and the Holst recovering native grass without saying much, and when he reached the corner where the contrast was sharpest, improved pasture still showing the scorch line from the 2022 summer on one side, and native grass already sending up the season's new growth on the other, he stood for a long time with his hands in his jacket pockets. "I didn't know this was here," he said. "It wasn't, until it was," Vera said. 2 of the 11 ranchers bought Galloway breeding stock from Danny's retained animals in the fall of 2023. 3 more made inquiries about the co-op channel and Marcus Teed's contact information. One asked if he could borrow Harold's third ledger for a week. Vera said she would make a copy. Danny began a formal records project in 2024, transcribing all 3 of Harold's ledgers and Vera's 30 years of herd records into a digital archive with photographs of the East 40 at 10-year intervals. She applied for a state agricultural preservation grant to document the reclamation process and received partial funding in the fall. She was 28. She spent her mornings at the kitchen table with the records and her afternoons on the land. Boots was getting older, but still worked the south pasture every morning, slower now, moving the herd with economy rather than speed. He lay under Vera's chair in the evenings, the same as he always had. The 40 acres that every rancher in the county had passed on in 1966, 1971, 1997, and again on every assessment since, was worth more than anyone who had assessed it could calculate, because what it was worth was not a figure that the assessor's tools had been built to find. What Vera's father understood working in Saskatchewan cattle journals and Nebraska soil by lamplight was that land tells you things if you ask it the same questions long enough. It does not rush its answers. It does not consult a projection sheet. It operates at the speed of root systems and seed sets and seasonal rains, and a person who knows one piece of ground well enough and has the patience to work with its answers rather than against them is accumulating something that does not show up on any debt-to-asset calculation. It comes across a kitchen table in a manila envelope and says everything it has been working toward for 30 years. The conventional world measures what it can count. It counts what it can standardize. What it cannot standardize, it calls a sentimental project, and it means the description as a kindness, a gentle steering away from disappointment. Dale Pruitt had not been wrong about the market that existed when he came to that equipment shed in 2014. He had been wrong about which market would matter by the time the reckoning arrived. He had been modeling a system that assumed the future would resemble the present, that improved ground would always outproduce rough ground, that commodity channels would always be the only channels that counted. He had not been modeling the drought, or the native roots, or the fat in a Galloway carcass, grass finished for 12 years on recovering prairie. What is built for efficiency becomes brittle when conditions change. What is built for resilience does not look like much until conditions change, and then it looks like everything. Vera Holst never told Ed Kovar he had been wrong. She never told Dale Pruitt he had cost her anything. She sold the co-op on the same terms the following year and the year after, and she kept the herd at 50 head, because that was what the land could carry, and she had no interest in what the land could not carry. The East 40 kept recovering. Danny found a third buyer for Galloway breeding stock in 2025, a rancher from north of the Loop River who had read the extension report. Dale helped write and wanted to see the ground for himself. He came on a morning in October, and Vera walked him out to the east fence and let him look. The blue stem was high and tawny in the October light. A band of Galloways moved through the far corner, patient and unhurried, their white belts visible from 100 yards. Boots sat beside Vera's boot and watched them. The visitor looked at the cattle for a long time. Then he looked at the ground. "How long has this been in the family?" he said. "Since 1966, Vera said. "Though the grass is older than that, what endures is what belongs to the land it grows in."